Any health-related information on the following show provides general information only. Content presented on any show by any host or guest should not be substituted for a doctor's advice. Always consult your physician before beginning any new diet, exercise, or treatment program.
Welcome to 5 to Thrive Live, a podcast about thriving for those who've been affected by cancer and chronic disease. I'm Dr. Lisa Schuler, and I co-host with my good friend Carolyn Gazella. You can find all of our past show podcasts on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Pandora, iTunes, Stitcher, and on our website, ithriveplan.com. Well, tonight I'm going to be talking with Judy Pearson, who is a best-selling author, an accomplished presenter, and a graduate of Michigan State University. But her favorite title is storyteller, with a little research junkie thrown in there. And those characteristics have resulted in 6 biographies, including award winners and a bestseller. An accomplished presenter, Judy has turned her book's subjects into presentations viewed by thousands in the U.S. and the UK. She was named one of Chicago's most inspirational women, selected as a finalist for the Arizona Healthcare Leadership Awards, and named a Phoenix Healthcare Hero. Judy and her husband live on Florida's beautiful Gulf Coast, where long beach walks ignite her creativity. And before we get to Judy, I want to thank our sponsors, without whom the show would not be possible. First, we have Cetria, a patented form of glutathione, clinically proven to raise blood glutathione levels. Glutathione is the master antioxidant and the body's primary defense against free radicals. It also helps to support respiratory health. So for more information, you can go to cetriaglutathione.com. Also, Cognizin Citicoline, nature's way of keeping your brain firing on all cylinders. So if you want to enhance your brain function, including memory, focus, and attention, look for Cognizin on the label of a dietary supplement or go to cognizin.com for more information. We also thank ProThrivers Wellness supplements, including ProThrivers Wellness Sleep, a supplement which combines higher dose melatonin and other sleep-supporting natural ingredients specifically designed for thrivers. And you can find ProThrivers Wellness Sleep at pureformulas.com. Finally, Dr. O'Hare's Probiotics, a best-selling probiotic for over 30 years, contains 12 probiotic strains, which are shelf-stable without refrigeration due to their unique 3-year fermentation process, and you can learn more at drohiraprobiotics.com. Well, hello, Judy. Welcome to 5 to Thrive Live.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really excited to be talking about this topic and your book. So first, maybe just tell us the book's name, and then we'll get into it.
Absolutely. The book is called Radical Sisters. It is the story of Shirley Temple Black, Rose Kushner, Evelyn Lauder, and the dawn of the breast cancer movement.
Okay, something we kind of almost take for granted now. So this is important stuff. So set the scene for us. What was America like, especially with regards to women's health in the last decades of the 20th century?
It was a bizarre mix of the Dark Ages and just an absolute veil of secrecy. Most of the doctors were men. Things weren't explained to women. They were considered to be either not smart enough or too emotional to understand. And the doctors actually went into surgical waiting rooms to ask husbands, fathers, brothers, their preferences regarding their loved one's breast cancer surgery in this case, but other types of surgery as well, to ask their preference instead of asking the woman prior to her own surgery.
Yeah, sounds really quite awful. And in addition to that, outside of the surgical suite, breast cancer was not really talked about in public either.
It was not. Breasts always adored, often ignored. Cancer was incredibly feared, and in fact, until About really, it didn't disappear probably till the 90s. It was thought to be contagious. So if you got a cancer diagnosis, you could lose your job. If you had insurance, that could be taken away. You couldn't adopt children. You couldn't join the military. Childhood survivors couldn't find college roommates. It was ridiculous. If you got invited to a Christmas cocktail party and you were a cancer survivor, you'd be served on paper plates because they were afraid that you would spread your, if you got invited at all, that you would spread your cancer germs. So it was pretty crazy. Um, and it didn't have a great outcome. About 2 in 4 cancer diagnoses were not survivors, they died.
Mhm.
And then with breast cancer, the two things that really played against women, first of all, was what was called the one-step procedure. A woman would present with a lump, and excuse me, her doctor would continually assure her it was fine, it was nothing. She'd go to the hospital because biopsies were inpatient procedures at that time, and they'd sign the necessary paperwork, be put under. If cancer was determined from their tumor, the doctor would just amputate their breast right then without talking to them, without waking them up. It was absolutely horrible. Excuse me.
Wow. Yeah, I mean,
And
that just sounds like something that would not be tolerated at all today.
it
I mean, there's
absolutely wasn't.
yeah.
It absolutely wasn't. And in fact, I interviewed an oncologist who said it was truly barbaric because there was no medical reason that it had to be done like that. You know, a breast tumor, when you can finally feel a lump, that cancer has been growing for a year, 2 years. So another week or two is not going to make any difference. And then the other really awful thing was what was called a radical mastectomy. So the title is sort of a play on words.
Mm.
Radical meaning, like we think of it, somebody who's really out there. But a radical mastectomy was first performed in the late 1800s by Dr. William Halsted, who tried to get to the root of the cancer. And the word radical is root in Latin. And so he thought the more he cut, the better it would be. So in addition to taking the breast, they took all the lymph nodes, they took pec muscles, sometimes they took clavicles and rib cages, and women were left debilitated, embarrassed, they led a life of shame and hid in the closet. Some even threatened suicide.
Wow. Yeah, so there were a few heroic figures that stood out at this time. So the first one that you talk about is Shirley Temple Black. So was she one of the first public figures to speak out, and what did she speak out about?
She was absolutely the first to talk about breast cancer. So again, back to the idea that breasts were so adored and yet ignored. You didn't talk about your own breasts ever in public. And as I said, you didn't talk about cancer. So when she found her lump, her movie career was long behind her. She had just been appointed a delegate to the United Nations, and she was actually preparing for her swearing in ceremony. Her doctor had instructed her a decade or two earlier about self exams, which were also really unheard of at that time. We're talking 1972 here. And she felt a lump. And by the time she could actually get scheduled with her doctor, about a month and a half had passed. And as she famously said, the doctor can make the incision, but I'm going to make the decision. And so she instructed her doctor at Stanford, you take out whatever you need to detect whether this is cancer or not, and then I'll decide what I'm going to do from there. And she chose a modified mastectomy, which meant that they took the breast and some of the lymph nodes. We didn't understand how lymph nodes worked or what their importance was. And now we have sentinel node biopsies that can determine how involved lymph nodes are. But at the time, that wasn't the case. And so she then decided to go public, and she held a press conference in her hospital room, which was totally unheard of. I actually watched the video. You can find it online, and there she is in her hospital room with her little gardenia behind her ear, looking all beautiful, telling women that they needed to touch their breasts and do exams, and then not to sit home and be afraid, because if it was bad news, that's what women did. They just stayed home and worried.
Yeah, right. Wow. Well, it just takes so much courage to make those kind of decisions, particularly when you're dealing with a disease that feels life-threatening, that is life-threatening, and you're up against a very entrenched medical establishment. So that's quite courageous. And then another person that you speak about is Rose Kushner. So she did some specific things to make her voice heard. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
I will. And let me just say that all three of these women did an amazing thing. They used their own diagnoses to help others. Shirley said, "How can I help my sisters?" So she followed up that press conference with a 7-page McCall's Magazine article, which again was a really important thing.
Mhm.
Rose found her own lump 2 years later in 1974. Before she even went to see her doctor, she found the lump on Saturday, called her doctor Monday morning. He couldn't see her till the afternoon. So she lived in Baltimore near the National Institutes of Health. She went to the amazing National Library of Medicine, where I've done lots of research, looking for information. And there was nothing for just ordinary women. But what she found was, of course, the whole one-step procedure and the radical mastectomy. And when she did finally get to her doctor, she said, "I'm not having it." She made her surgeon sign a document saying that I will take only the lump. And when she came to, he was looming over her head and said, "Well, you've just killed yourself. You have cancer and now you're going to die." And of course,
Wow.
that was ridiculous. She had to go from Baltimore all the way to Buffalo to Roswell Park Cancer Center to find a surgeon who would do a modified radical mastectomy. And she was a budding journalist trying to break into the big time. It's hard. I know it is. And she wrote a story about her experience, but no one would publish it. And then, just a few months after Rose's cancer, First Lady Betty Ford was diagnosed. And suddenly, Rose's article became timely. She said if she'd known that breast cancer would get her into the Washington Post, she would have arranged to get it years earlier. And then that article became the very first handbook for women who were diagnosed with cancer. It was published just about exactly a year after her own diagnosis. So, just like Rose, she started helping other people. And we know that volunteering or pro social behavior, whatever you want to call it, I call it finding a second act after cancer, that is a really healthy thing to do. So actually, all three of these women did that. But she proclaimed she had a loud voice and a stubborn streak, and she started testifying before Congress. And because of her, um, their insurance was mandated. Insurance companies were mandated to cover reconstruction, mammography, which was just coming into being, and Rose made it possible for us to have our treatments covered, because I too am a cancer survivor.
Amazing. I mean, really just remarkable. And I mean, oddly, even though you're talking about the 1970s, that doesn't feel too long ago. So it's just really remarkable that there are women living today that probably were diagnosed in this transformative time. And,
Well, and you're absolutely right. And all of my biographies, I write the way I like to read. So I love reading biography, but in order to appreciate the person who's the subject, you have to kind of understand the temperature of the country, the world, society at that time. So in this particular book, I talk about the women's health movement, which was an offshoot of the women's movement, and I talk about women in medicine. There weren't many, even until, golly, just the last 15 years, the numbers have increased. It was a good old boys club. And, Listen, I'm not anti-man. I have only a brother, no sisters. I have only sons, no daughters. I like men so much, I've married 3 of them. But but they were just, going along with society at the time, and women weren't thought to be smart enough or emotionally stable enough to become doctors.
Right. Well, you'll be happy to know that now females outnumber males in medical school. So
Woohoo!
things have definitely changed. Okay, so the third one is Evelyn Lauder, Estee Lauder's daughter-in-law. So she obviously had access to a lot of wealth and privilege. So what inspired her to dedicate herself to this work? And, what kind of drove her beyond her family legacy in this regard?
So when she was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1988, so now we're that much further along in in treating it. Chemotherapy existed, lumpectomies were being done. She too, like Shirley, had access to the best healthcare, had unlimited funds, and she went through it very quietly, very stoically. Although she allowed her husband Leonard to talk her into a radical, quote unquote, oncologist who proved to be become her partner in this mission to make cancer better for women, breast cancer better for women. His name is Dr. Larry Norton, and he actually is still at Memorial Sloan Kettering. So the first thing that Evelyn realized, and she said, we've asked women for decades to trust in us, to buy our family's products. Now it's time we gave back. So she sat Dr. Norton down at her kitchen table and said, look, I had to travel all over the city, over here for a diagnostic mammogram, over there for more testing, over here to get treatment, and then afterwards, then there was go there for the wig, go there for whatever psychosocial help I needed, and I had a limousine. I can't imagine what it would be like for a woman who had to take the subway or crisscross the country, or the city in a cab. And so she said that she envisioned a breast center sort of like a department store. You can go into a department store, you can buy cosmetics, of course, and then housewares and children's clothes and shoes. And she said, that's what I want to see happen. And although the Lauder money certainly could have built that breast center, she wanted the city and hopefully the country to buy into it. So they started fundraising, and 3 years later, the Evelyn Lauder Breast Center opened at Memorial Sloan Kettering, the very first of its kind. Now it's like not such a big deal. And then she and Dr. Norton sat down again, realizing that there was a real dearth of research dollars, because by the time a researcher can be considered for, let's say, a National Cancer Institute grant to further their research, they had to be pretty far along. So the younger investigators, those who didn't have lots of contacts, while they may have had great ideas, they just weren't followed up on. They wanted to create grants for these out of the box ideas. And they together, Dr. Norton and Evelyn, created the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, which funded Dr. Mary Claire King's research. She was the discoverer of the BRCA genetic mutation. They funded all kinds of other research that has now resulted into a much easier road for breast cancer survivors to follow. And then those two projects bookended probably her most famous project. Evelyn and her good friend Alexandra Penny, who was at that time the editor of Self magazine, are the co-creators of the pink ribbon. A California grandmother was handing out peach-colored ribbons, and when they read about her, they said, "Oh, what a great idea!" So they contacted her, and Charlotte was this grandmother's name, and Charlotte said no, she didn't want to partner with them, and they said, "Why?" And she said, "Because you'll just commercialize it." And they were like, "But do you realize the reach we have?" And Charlotte said, "I don't care," and hung up. And they were dumbfounded. So they went to their lawyers and said, "What can we do?" And the lawyers said, "Pick a different color." And so they picked pink. And of course, the pink ribbon is the most famous breast cancer icon. We toss the word awareness around a lot today. But
Mm-hmm.
in the 90s and even the first decade of this century, there was not much awareness. People were afraid, people were busy with other things. And so the awareness that that created was huge in saving lives of all the women and men, because men get breast cancer too, rarely, but they get it, who came afterwards.
Yeah, I think that, some people sort of get turned off by the pink, but honestly, that pink ribbon did almost more for breast cancer than, I mean, aside from some of the treatments than I can think of, because it really took something that was taboo and shameful, and it brought it out into the open in a very profound way. So all of a sudden,
Absolutely.
women were almost empowered about their cancer journey, and yeah, total change in how
Absolutely.
breast cancer was managed.
And I was one of those women at the outset where, my treatment actually ended in November. I had my surgery in late May, just after Memorial Day, and then my chemo started, and I finished my chemotherapy a week after Thanksgiving in November of 2011. And watching Pinktober and the NFL wearing pink, and this guy wearing pink,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
eat yogurt and support breast cancer, and I was like, this is just a big sham. And some of it might be materialized, but by golly, it brought awareness to the disease, didn't it?
Yeah, well, I think it also conveyed, like all the people behind the Dannon yogurt and the football players were in support of, saw the human behind the cancer. And I
Yes.
think that's a really critical part of it. So these three radical sisters never met, did they?
They didn't. They didn't. Um, Certainly, Rose would have been aware of Shirley Temple and aware of the Lauder name. And by the time, and Shirley was interesting. Shirley, after the McCall's article came out in January, the year after her cancer, she had her treatment in November. The McCall's article came out in January. In March of '73, she went on the Mike Douglas show. And then that was the end of her cancer advocacy. It certainly was a great deal. So by the time Rose sadly died of metastasis of her disease, her voice was so loud. She used to say, I have a loud voice and a stubborn streak. And they certainly would have known of her, but they just kind of came and went in this beautiful arc. And just to kind of tell the secret of publishing, so authors come up with ideas, but then their agents and their editors were all in the business to make money with these books, get a say. And in my case, my editor and agent said, I wanted to write about Rose. And they were like, you know what? She sounds wonderful. But if we added some better known names, that will kind of elevate the overall title and thereby hopefully sales. And I kind of pouted for a day and then came back and said, okay. And Lisa, it just made this beautiful story. It was the three really made a wonderful history. Again, it was the dawn of the breast cancer movement, which didn't pick up until then the mid to late 90s.
Yeah, I'm glad you have all three in there. I think that
Yeah.
that's makes it much more powerful. So, you mentioned you're a breast cancer survivor and you wrote the book. Was that part of the original motivation for writing the book? Did that make it easier, more difficult?
It's funny. I'm being asked that a lot, and that never even occurred to me while I was writing it. After my own cancer, I was already a biographer. I was writing about World War II and actually looking for the next story to tell when I was diagnosed. So, on the other side of cancer, I couldn't find the story. So, I started a little organization and met a woman who became the inspiration for my first post cancer book. And that's called From Shadows to Life. And it's the biography of the cancer survivorship movement, which is a whole other story and very
Mhm.
interesting. And actually, that particular woman who was my inspiration um, lived in Tucson, lives in Tucson still, and worked for the cancer center at the University of Arizona. In that book, I learned about Rose. I learned about Mary Lasker, who was the subject of my second post cancer book. And I just, I just get driven to tell these stories. But it wasn't difficult for me. And I didn't even think, other than being interested in saying, oh, wow, that's why they do that, or that's why they say that, or, oh, wow, that was really awful. I'm glad I got cancer when I did, if I had to get it. Other than that, it was just sort of not even in my mind that I was writing because of me. But what I do recognize beyond everything is the debt of gratitude I owe these women.
Hmm. Yeah, well, that's beautifully said. So, you've written this book about the dawn of the breast cancer movement. And what would be a home run for you with this book? What do you want it to accomplish?
Well, as I said, the importance with any life challenge is to find the treasure in your wreckage. What happened to you, whether it's cancer or anything else, is awful. So you can't undo the diagnosis, you can't undo the tragedy, but perhaps some good could come of it. And when you find that good, there's a great deal of healing and helping. So that's what you need to do moving forward. And secondly, then, I'd really like readers to consider what they would do following what Shirley, Rose, and Evelyn did. There's one of my favorite quotes that applies, in fact, to this accidental trilogy that I've written, that cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So even if we're not celebrities and we're not billionaires, we're just ordinary people like I am, it doesn't matter. If you can help one person, that might make your difficulty, your life challenge, might make sense to you, and certainly can help the person who's in need.
Hmm. Well, and I think too, having that historical perspective on sort of the public awareness and the way in which we hold this disease and the women who are diagnosed with it, having that historical perspective, I think empowers women in a very unique way. It's one thing to be given a lot of autonomy in your decision making and to be given hope and all of that. Those are empowering too. But remembering that women were very courageous before you and that some of the decisions that we are allowed to make were actually because of their courage is actually an empowering thing. It kind of, for me at least, it makes me feel connected to a group even of unseen women who
That's
I
right.
never met and never will meet. So,
Yep.
just part of a better collective. So what final thoughts would you like to leave with our listeners?
I just really hope that whether you have experienced any cancer, breast cancer, that you will look back in history, because we think at the time that something happens that it's the end of the world. And then when you realize that other people have had it rough, that times have been tougher than this, that whatever, as you just said, whatever we do today can impact the future. And it's really, really important to study the past, because it not only inspires you, but we learn from the past. That's why the National Archives, which is like a second home to me, above the door it says the past is prologue, meaning everything that happens in the past is just the start of the story. So I hope that readers read it and think about that. And while it's a story about breast cancer, it's a story about three boss babes, and who wouldn't love that kind of inspiration?
Yeah, that's right. So how can people find your book? Where should they go?
It's available everywhere. The prologue is available free of charge, as are all my prologues, on my website, Judith L. Pearson, Pearson.com. Follow me on Instagram at Judith P. Writes. And I love book clubs. Invite me to your book club, virtually or in person. And lastly, on every book page on my website, there's a little button you can click, and I will send you an autographed book plate that you can stick inside your book And that way, it makes it a great gift. Black Friday's coming. Start shopping early.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Judy. It's been really a delight speaking with you. And thank you for writing this book and bringing our history forward. And that wraps up this episode of 5 to Thrive Live. Again, we thank our sponsors. First, ProThrivers Wellness Sleep Formula. Also, Cetria Glutathione, the superior glutathione to support liver and immune health. Cognizin Citicoline to help enhance memory, focus, and attention. And Dr. Ohhira's award-winning, shelf-stable probiotic. And thank you, listener, for joining us. May you experience joy, laughter, and love. It's time to thrive, everyone. Have a great night.